Hey, so today we're going to look at the rise of the fascist dictators. And the first thing we're going to start with will be our web diagram. And this focuses on the rise of fascism and Nazism. So we're going to look at Italy and Germany. So our first circle on our web diagram is World War I. How exactly is this contributing to the rise of fascism within Europe? We know that the Paris Peace Conference, that they had redrawn national borders, and this was not along the lines that some countries were hoping would happen. Italy did not receive all the territories they were promised, so the land along the Adriatic that had belonged to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, they were not granted it, even though they were promised that land if they had joined along the side of the Allies. We know Germany is highly upset over the loss of their territory. They lost land that went back to Denmark. They lost land along their border with France, so they had to cannot militarize the Rhineland. The SARS right now is under the control of the League of Nations, and everything out of it is going toward the French. We know that they lost land to create Poland and Czechoslovakia, so highly upset. Austria-Hungary has been split. German reparations, we know this is a huge issue. They had to hand over all their colonies, their gold, and now they have to pay the $33 billion in reparations on top of everything else that they had to give up. And we also know that the League of Nations is a weak organization. Its purpose is to create peace and unity and to, stop any disputes that would ever, rise up. But it's an organization that excluded Russia, and for quite some time it excluded Germany. And the United States, the most powerful nation that comes out of World War I, is not a member. And the League of Nations does not have any military backing. So it's powerless. It has nothing that they can do to actually stop a nation if they want to be aggressive. Now, there are times when countries will want to sit down and negotiate, and the League of Nations will do a great job. They are great at being the mediator. But if it comes down to actually physically stopping someone, they have no power to do so. They have no army. Economic problems. You're looking at worldwide depression. So we know that Europe was in a struggle after World War I. And then when the stock market crashed here in the United States, then we're going to see this depression spread all over. And people are going to start to look for answers because they have these new democratic nations. How are they going to handle it? And they're just not handling it fast enough. And so many of them start to go back to the types of governments they had before. And fascism starts to provide these answers. We can fix these problems. They're looking at high unemployment. They're looking at inflation. We looked at the inflation issue in Germany last week. And then that decline of trade. They need that trade in between countries. And right now, these economic problems are mounting up. And if someone can offer a solution, then they're willing to give them a shot. And then these weak governments, these new democratic nations really are not familiar with how a democracy should work or can work. They're used to that stability of a monarchy, of an authoritarian government. And now they're thrown into a democratic society. So they see the idea of these political parties and these different factions within these political parties as actually a weakness to democracy. I mean, you look at here in our own country, we've been a democratic nation since the 1700s. And you look at our political parties, yes, we have the Republicans and we have the Democrats and the Libertarians. I mean, we have different political parties. It's not tearing apart our democracy. We are still live and thriving in 2021. We allow for those different voices, for those different points of views to be out there. But within these new democratic nations, they see it as a problem and a weakness and tearing it down. Italy is dealing with the rise of taxes, and that's the last thing anyone's wanting to see during an economic depression is a rise in taxes. And when we look at Germany, they definitely do not support the Weimar Republic. This democratic government And they see that this is the government that sold them out at the Paris Peace Conference by signing that Treaty of Versailles. And so you have the liberals and the conservatives both questioning the validity of this government. Leadership. As we saw within Russia and looking at that totalitarian regime and what the leader would look like, very persuasive, very dynamic, this cult figure, this personality, cult of personality figure, we're going to see the same thing here within a fascist nation. We're going to see, that they're going to promote extreme forms of nationalism. You are expected complete loyalty, showing that nationalistic, ability that you have for this country. They're going to exploit their fears, the citizens' fears. And right now, one of those fears is communism within these countries. They don't want communism to spread, and they're going to use that to their advantage. They're going to play on what people were so scared of, and that, hey, if you follow me, I can stop it. It won't come your way, but you have to follow me. And they're going to use terror and intimidation. We saw that within Stalin's regime with his communist control, but it's really a totalitarian control under the backdrop of communism. But the use of terror and intimidation, and what we're going to see, the tools that was used in Stalin's regime, we're going to see the same tools being used in Germany and in Italy. So now let's move on to our beliefs and our policies. And, again, this is going to apply for both here. So fascism is a political movement that is going to stress extreme loyalty or extreme nationalism to the state and its leader. And I added some additional things. These are things that I would have written along the side of the board and told you to write them down. So I do want you to write these down. It is very militaristic. You are going to see that military right out there in your face, always present, always on the street, always monitoring what you're doing. It is a one-party rule. And we had that over in Stalin's totalitarian regime too. It's one party. And it's who we say is going to be on the ballot. And it's who we say you're going to vote for. If you choose not to vote for that person, or you choose to write in on that ballot, then you're going to be beat up when you leave the building. And in some instances, they actually poured hot boiling oil down people's throats. So for my brave students in my second period who are those superheroes, you are highly monitored and you will be dealt with if you do not follow along lines. The state is supreme. It is the ultimate, and your loyalty is to that state at all times. They completely disregard your individual rights, and we saw that within Stalin's regime too. You have no individual rights. The leaders become the symbolic figure of that state, of that nation. And we have El Duce, Mussolini, and the Führer, and Hitler. They represent the state, the nation, the government, that country, and whatever they do, everyone else in the world will assume you, as a member of that nation, of that state, follow right along with them. When we look at which groups are going to support fascists, these are people who are a little disgruntled with how things came out after World War I. So you have the aristocracy, you have the industrialists, the veterans, and we saw some of those disgruntled veterans when we had our stations with Germany, and that lower middle class. So these are the people that these leaders will be able to pull from to get that extreme loyalty and to get everyone else in line. So let's look at Mussolini. We're going to, this week, particularly look at some comparisons with Mussolini and Hitler. And Mussolini is the one who actually introduces the world to fascism. So fascism starts here within Italy, and he will be the teacher of Hitler. And we're going to see that the student will eventually bypass that teacher. So in Italy, fascism will gain followers due to the people's disappointment over the decisions at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Again, very upset with the outcome. Their representative was not able to gain what was promised them. And when he left the Paris Peace Conference, his government was in complete collapse. They're upset over the economic conditions, the inflation and unemployment. So the economic conditions was really weighing on the people as well, and believing that if they could have gained what was promised at that Paris Peace Conference, then those things would have not have been in such dire straits that they were. Mussolini is seen as a very strong leader with a very strong vision on how to improve Italy. But when you look at Mussolini's speeches, he talks about what Italy could become, things that, they could become like that Holy Roman Empire again. They can become that cultural center again. They can be a great power again. They can have this territory again. But he never explains how in the world he's going to achieve that. So it's a lot of fluff. And it's the fluff that people wanted to hear, but he has no vision on exactly how to get there. And when we're going to watch a video on Tuesday on Mussolini, and we're going to see that he's a very wishy-washy guy. Today he supports this, tomorrow he's completely against it and supports something totally different. And he liked the image of being this leader of this great nation, but in essence, he really became a joke to some of the other countries and leaders around the world. In October 1922, he has this march on Rome. And down here we have this picture of this march on Rome. And really, it was just to display this military might of taking Rome over. He was already in charge. The government at that time could have, if they wanted to actually send out the military and stop them. But it was like, why? The people are so up in arms. They want this man. Let them have him. There, it's all yours, Mussolini. But he still wanted this demonstration of, look at my military might. I'm taking charge of Italy's government and no one can stop me. That's because they chose not to stop him. Hitler, on the other hand, is going to be a little different. He's not someone, well, except for Stalin. Stalin will mock him, but other nations and their leaders will fear him. And Mussolini, even though he was the one who Hitler went to learn about fascism and the structure of it within Italy, even Mussolini will get to the point where he will fear Hitler. So Germany's form of fascism we refer to as Nazism. And we'll see through our Clips of the Century series, or America's Time in the Century series on Thursday, that Hitler is a very organized and he is a great orator, a great speaker. We'll see in some of his speeches that he starts off very calmly, very quietly, and that will get his audience to stop talking and listening, because it will be a little hard to hear him if, he's speaking softly and you're chit-chatting with your neighbor. But as his speech continues, his voice will start to get a little louder. He gets really heated and into his speech and very dramatic toward the end. And then that gets the people all riled up and joining right along with him. And Hitler will eventually become the head of that Nazi party. Now, Hitler was one of those disgruntled World War I veterans, and with a particular group, not long after World War I, he and this group had designed a plan to overthrow the government. And for Hitler, there was someone within that particular group who actually told on them, and they were stopped. And while he was imprisoned, he wrote Mein Kampf. And Mein Kampf became his blueprint. He spelled everything out of what needed to be done to build this great nation, this Third Reich in Germany. He sets forth his anti-Semitic beliefs. So if you had read Mein Kampf, you knew exactly what this man had intended to do. And is also his plans for conquest, Lebensraum, the fact that they needed to expand the German territory. They needed more living space. So through that conquest of taking over all those territories, that was to create that living space because of the growth of this Third Reich that they were going to create, that the German people, that the Aryan people needed all of that land to live on. So when we start to look at what Hitler's going to do once he is completely in power, it won't be a surprise because he put it all there in his book. But during this time, Hitler was a nobody. He was a disgruntled World War I veteran who tried to overthrow the government and failed. He wrote a book. No one's paying attention to this book. It's not sitting on the people's tables in Germany until Hitler is actually the leader of Germany. And just like we have within Italy, and as we saw on our web diagram, they are going to play on the economic problems. Germany's economic problems and that fear of communism will help him to legally take power. So once he's out of incarceration, he will be able to legally come to power, and he will legally, under the Enabling Act, to be able for 4 years to have complete control without anyone getting in his way. Legally, all of those things will happen. Germany will become a totalitarian state under Hitler, and it will model what we saw within Stalin's Soviet Union. Although Hitler is a fascist on the far right of the spectrum, and Stalin is a communist on the far left of the spectrum, their behavior will be identical. And at this time, because of the fear of the spread of communism, which has been, branded into their minds since the Bolsheviks took over Russia, no one wants to see communism spread. So when Hitler's rising to power, and for us in 2021, looking at it, saying, why isn't anyone stopping him? Because they see Hitler and they will see Mussolini, these fascist states, as being that block to keep the communists at bay, keep them in the East, keep them in Russia, and not spread to the other nations in the West. So our new democracies, after World War I, we know that all of the new countries that were created, pretty much every nation in Europe except Russia, became a democratic government. But they all tend to fall to dictators or to kings. So you had the rise of Mussolini, we had the rise of Hitler, and then the other nations, they went back to their authoritarian governments because they saw that the democratic governments were not meeting the needs of the people, or at least not fast enough. With that worldwide depression, they went back. If me following a king is going to keep some food on my table, then I'm willing to let that food sit on my table and take that royal family back and not worry about the fact that I don't have a voice. So that goes back to Thomas Hobbes's social contract, where we as people are willing to give up our rights, or we should be willing to give up our rights to a strong type of government to bring order and stability. And they saw that this democracy was not providing them order and stability. And so many of them went back to those governments. We saw within Germany and in Italy, they fell to dictatorships, but they were also providing them that order and stability is what they're saying. They're just, at this moment in time with our notes, we're not saying what the cost is going to be to allow those dictators to provide order and stability. But by 1935, the only nation in Eastern Europe still to embrace democracy is Czechoslovakia. And we have to see what's going to happen to Czechoslovakia. Will the powers such as Great Britain, France, those strong democratic nations, will they protect Czechoslovakia? Will the United States step in and protect Czechoslovakia? We're just going to have to wait and see. Spain ended up having their own fascist rise up, and that's going to be under General Francisco Franco. He leads the military in revolt against the country's Republican government. So again, we have a fascist movement that's now taking place in Spain. It took place in Italy, it took place in Germany, and now it's in Spain. Foreign nations will come in to assist the different sides. It's not a surprise that Italy and Germany are there to assist Franco because he is trying to establish a fascist regime within Spain. That's wonderful. You have those three nations right there together. But what may surprise you is that the only government to actually step in and try to protect this Republican government, this democratic government, is Stalin and the Soviet Union. No other nation steps in. One of the things that you can give a little credit to Stalin is the fact that he saw the problem with fascism. Yes, it was a threat to communism, but he definitely did see the problem with the rise of fascism. And it's kind of like, are you guys really going to allow the fascists to take over all of Europe? Now, there were people in countries such as France, Great Britain, and the United States, in Canada, who felt that their countries should step in and stop this fascist movement. And so they ended up being foreign volunteers. So we ended up with about 40,000 foreign volunteers who will actually go over and work with the Soviet Union to try to stop this fascist movement within Spain. One of those people was George Orwell. And I know quite a few of you have been reading Animal Farm in your English classes. He also wrote 1984 and Homage to Catalonia. And with George Orwell, this became his experience of really seeing the interworkings of Stalin. Because even during this war that they're fighting to try to stop this fascist takeover, Stalin is still going after elements of Trotsky. So we know that Trotsky under Lenin was the Commissar of War and had built this Red Army. He, even during this war, was telling his military to attack members of their own military. And for George Orwell, this was like a shock. It was devastating to see the interworkings of Stalin and his control over his nation. And so you start to see a lot of his works going after the Soviet Union. So you'll get your Animal Farm and you'll get your 1984. But 1984 will also be a question, a warning to all nations, because as he saw this, all nations stood by and allowed for the rise of these fascist dictators and what they're going to take us into, and that's going to be World War II. In the end, Francisco Franco is going to prevail. He wins, and he will establish a military dictatorship as fascist rule within Spain. Although his dictatorship is going to be more along the lines of an authoritarian rule regime, where Hitler is going to be that totalitarian. Now, Guernica, this famous painting by Picasso. So on April 27th, 1937, this was this attack on this civilian population that Hitler does. This is, let's see how my war machine can play out. We're going to use high explosives. We're going to use these bombs, and we're going to do this over 3 hours, which just completely destroys this town. And here you have the pictures of the crumbling buildings, and you see that destruction. And even in this painting, you see the agony that the people are going through. And again, you have these weird geometric shapes that are put into place that, typically we don't look at each other in these weird geometric shapes, but this is what the world has come to. But we can still see the devastation that's being brought upon us. And, for 3 days, this city is burning, and we end up with 1,600 civilians killed or wounded. And for what? Why? Why do this? Why didn't Franco step in and stop it? Because he was not in a position to stop it. When other nations come in to assist you in your war, They are demonstrating they are more powerful than you are. You can't win it without them. He cannot stop them. And what Hitler is doing, this is his trial run. This was his opportunity to try out his war machine because he has plans. He is taking the world into another world war. And it's going to be on his timetable, and it's going to happen the way he wants it to happen. So now we have finished our notes over